Welcome back to Filling in the History. This is episode 15, I believe, and we are going to be talking about way too much today. I'm going to really strive to kind of put this into context, but the way that it's organized is we've got sections 30 through 36, so that's a lot of content to cover. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to break up the parts that we usually do by the time in which the revelations were given. So September, October, November, and December, 4 parts for 1830. This is kind of the end. This is actually, we're getting to a point in the history of the church now where we're kind of done with some major early documentation that is very foundational to anyone part of this movement from Joseph Smith's leadership. So we're going to get into that today. Um, but yeah, a lot of stuff to cover because technically speaking, section 30 is actually, what is it, 3 different revelations? So there's just revelations galore. You will be revealed to so hard today. It's going to be amazing. You're going to love it. I probably offended somebody there. But anyway, moving on. Part 1. September of 1830. We're going to be talking about sections 30 and 31. And I'm just going to dive into it. Hopefully I don't go too fast. So as an introduction to section 30, let's talk about it. The earliest copy that we have is in Revelation Book 1, handwriting of John Whitmer. Now, it is called 31st, 32nd, and 33rd Commandments, given to David Whitmer, Peter Whitmer, and John Whitmer, respectively. So in the Book of Commandments, it follows this where you have chapter 31, chapter 32, chapter 33 for these revelations. In 1835, when they published the book of the Doctrine and Covenants, they were combined together into what we now have as section 52 and what we today call section 30. So that is how that came about. So these are 3 revelations smashed into one. I think I said this in a previous episode, but generally speaking, when you see a revelation and there's an amen there, that generally, I mean, you can put it down. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 exceptions to this, but that means that they took a bunch of revelations and combined them together into one. So usually because they were probably too short. So that's that. We get no difference between the 1981 and 2013 section headings, besides the removal of history of the church. And the other thing that may be of interest is that section 28 comes between sections 29 and 30. So from last episode of this in the Revelation books, the way John Whitmer put them together, there is section 28 there. That was 2 episodes ago. So see that if you want to get into section 28. And that's where we are. So the circumstances revolving around this, what I'm going to call parts 1 through 3. I've gone through each one of these to see. A lot of it was copy pasted from the previous Revelation. So just trust me on that, or go read it for yourself if you like. But Revelation book 1 gives a commandment to David Whitmer, telling him that he feared God or feared man more than God, etc. That seems like kind of a negative way to start a revelation. After that, a revelation to Peter Whitmer Jr., his calling to the Lamanites, etc. A little bit more pleasant. And finally, a revelation to John Whitmer, his call to the ministry, give, etc. Whatever that means. So you got one guy is sort of being told you're fearing man more than God, and then the other 2 are like, hey, you're going to be called to either a mission or to your ministry. So I thought that was interesting. Again, all 3 of these combined together later on. So in draft 1, so I'm again going after, there's 3 drafts of this version, but I'm going to go after the earliest one in the manuscript history. It gives us a little bit more, kind of fills this out a little bit more. It says, conference at length assembled. The subject of the stone, etc., was brought up, and after considerable discussion, reasoning, etc., and investigation, Hiram agreed to renounce the stone and its author, and the brethren unanimously agreed to renounce them also. We now partook of the sacrament, confirmed and ordained many, and attended to a great variety of church business. During that and the following day, during which time we had much of the power of God manifested, the Holy Ghost poured out upon us, and obtained the following revelations. So taking you back to section 28, this is Hiram Page receiving apparently a black stone where lettering would appear. You would write it down, that lettering would disappear, and the new lettering would appear on this black stone. And the Whitmers, Oliver Cowdery, believed that these revelations were real. So Hiram Page brought it up. And it was a bit of a threat to Joseph's authority, if you want to call it that. But basically, he kind of brought it up to this conference, apparently, and they all said, yeah, it looks like that's not of God. They destroyed the stone and smashed it to bits, and apparently burned all of the documentation, which is kind of a bummer. It'd be fun to see what those said. Um, I say with I should probably say that in more of an evil way, but anyway. Uh, so yeah, that's what the conference was about. And this conference, by the way, my goodness, we have like 2 revelations previous to it. We have a bunch of revelations after this. So for some reason, this conference, which was like, I think 9 people, was huge. Like tons of stuff happened. We think of conferences like you're going to fill like the Javits Center or something, but that's, yeah, not the case here. Anyway, what I like about that statement from draft 1 is that is the end of draft 1. That's the end of it. We are now coming to the end of a lot of these early manuscript historical efforts that were done during Joseph Smith's lifetime. So thus ends draft 1. Now, draft 2 gives a slightly different accounting of it, but again, a lot of it's grammatical. And there was a lot of corrections made. It was cleaner copies as we go along. Anyway, so a little bit more to this from the historical introduction from Documents Volume 1. It says, the revelation to David Whitmer featured here, as well as the 2 that follow, directed to Peter Whitmer Jr. and John Whitmer, respectively, originated during the Second Conference of the Church of Christ held in Fayette, New York in late September 1830. In describing that conference, Joseph Smith's history stated that, quote, peace and faith and hope and charity abounded in our midst, unquote. And then added, before we separated, we obtained the following. Revelation to David Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Jr., and John Whitmer. Although these 3 texts were treated as separate revelations in Revelation Book 1 and in the 1833 Book of Commandments, they were combined into a single revelation in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. And basically, you can rinse and repeat that. For part 3, we do get a slight difference in the historical introduction, which says, this revelation for John Whitmer originated, like the 2 that preceded it, at the Second Conference of the Church of Christ, which was held in Fayette, New York in late September 1830. It commanded John Whitmer, who was one of the 6 founding elders of the church who had received a license as an elder and an apostle, to preach the gospel. After the church's first conference in June, Whitmer traveled with Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and they later traveled to Colesville, New York, to baptize believers. Now, inside of this revelation, there's a man named. It's like, hey, go to Philip Burrows. So my question is, who is Philip Burrow? And I think I'm saying that right. Here you go. Historical introduction. Parley P. Pratt, who was baptized and ordained an elder on September 1, 1830, had preached successfully in Seneca Falls shortly after his conversion. He gave a sermon at Philip Burrows' home a few miles northeast of the Whitmer farm, where he, quote, spoke the word of God with power, reasoning out of the scriptures and the Book of Mormon. The people were convinced, overwhelmed in tears, and 4 heads of families came forward, expressing their faith, and were baptized, unquote. This revelation informed John Whitmer, quote, thy labor shall be at thy brother Philip's, or Philip Burrows, unquote, and the surrounding area. So that's who Philip Burrows is. He's part of the sort of the early converts of the church. Footnote 2 that we have says, it is unclear whether Burrows was baptized into the church, according to a 12 March 1831 letter from an unidentified group of Palmyra citizens. Burrows had previously been one of the principal men of property among the Mormons, but by that time had refused to obey Joe any longer. Burrows' wife, however, seems to have joined the church and continued as a member. There you go. Now, I believe that Philip Burrows may actually be the inspiration for the Steed family, just because that's a very similar story if you ever read The Work and the Glory, which is the Steed family is like the fictional family that's there. Anyway, just a little side note there. So that's what you get. That's section 30. 3 different revelations combined into one. In the document series, the next thing that we get is actually the minutes of a conference. This big, huge conference that has revelations coming before and after it, and we're revelating like crazy right now. It says here that this came next. So we get the copy from Minute Book 2. So there are these minute books that were kept, and the handwriting is of Ebenezer Robinson. So what they would do is they would they would write the minutes for the day, and then they would copy them over a lot like the letter books, where they would just say, I'm probably going to lose this. And they would copy it over into the book and usually vote and ratify that those minutes are accurate. And then many times they would actually burn the originals. I know they did that with the Council of 50 Minutes. They would just say, okay, we got it. Okay, burn the original. Let's move on. So we don't have the original copies. So the meeting was supposed to have lasted 3 days. So we assume that some of the notes are lost because there's not really a whole lot to get. In fact, I will read the whole thing out to you. It's so short. But first, the historical introduction of this says, although the minutes featured here do not mention these controversies, Joseph Smith had determined to deal with them at the conference. And this is talking about Hiram Smith Stone and so forth. And his history offered this report, quote, at length our conference assembled, the subject of the stone was discussed, and after considerable investigation, Brother Page, as well as the whole church who were present, renounced the said stone and all things connected therewith, much to our mutual satisfaction, unquote. The issue of Joseph Smith's authority is alluded to in the minutes, which state, quote, Brother Joseph Smith, Jr. was appointed by the voice of the conference to receive and write revelations and commandments for this church, unquote. Cowdery, who had both challenged Joseph Smith over the wording of the Articles and Covenants in July and initially accepted Page's revelations, read aloud Articles and Covenants to the conference, after which Joseph Smith gave his own commentary. Joseph Smith's history reported that the utmost harmony prevailed during the 3-day conference, and all things were settled satisfactorily to all present. Again, if just to be crystal clear, the Articles and Covenants of the Church is what we now call Section 20. So they just read the whole thing out. So that's what that is. We also kind of get what I question to be maybe the first statistical report of the church. So in general conferences, we actually don't even do this anymore. The general conferences for a long time, they'd get up and they'd say, this is how many people were baptized, this is how many children of record were baptized, and this is how many wards and branches that we have, this is how many stakes that we have, this is how many members of the church that we have. We don't do that anymore. It is in the conference reports, but it's not, spoken over the pulpit. But the first, I guess this was way back in the day. I just find it funny because the numbers are great. So this is from the historical introduction. The minutes also demonstrate an early attempt to track the growing membership of the church. Though no list of members from this date survives, the exactness with which the number of both recently baptized persons and total membership are given here suggests a careful attempt to keep official records of those uniting with the church. So it's pretty short. So if you will, I am just going to say it. So the contents, here's what it says. Quote, Brother Joseph Smith, Jr. was appointed by the voice of the conference to receive and write revelations and commandments for this church. The 5th chapter of Isaiah read by Brother Joseph Smith, Jr., and prayer by the same. Articles and Covenants read by Brother Oliver Cowdery, and remarks by Brother Joseph Smith, Jr. Number of the several members uniting to this church since the last conference, 35. Making in whole, now belonging to this church, 62. Brother Newell Knight ordained a priest under the hand of Brother Oliver Cowdery, and prayer by the same. Prayer by all present. Exhortation by all the elders respectively. Singing in prayer in behalf of Brother Oliver Cowdery and Peter Whitmer, Jr., who were previously appointed to go to the Lamanites. Conference adjourned to January 1, 1831, to be held at this place. Brother David Whitmer appointed to keep the church records until the next conference. Prayer by Brother Oliver Cowdery. The foregoing minutes were taken at the time of this conference by Oliver Cowdery. So there you go. There's a conference of the church. And look out now. We've got, what is it again? 62 members of the church at the time. Really fun. So many revelations came from this. And that was the entire membership of the church. So what's the aftermath of this? Well, we get 2 sections before it, and we get 4 sections right after it. So this was a very important conference. They all seem to hover around this early gathering. And then footnote 5. Perhaps owing to the controversy with Cowdery over Articles and Covenants, the document, which had been previously read aloud and approved by the church at the 9 June 1830 conference, was again read aloud. Although Joseph Smith commented on Articles and Covenants, those present were not asked to again approve the document. And also, I will add to this as well, this is the only time that I know of in a general conference of the church where everyone there said a prayer. If we did that today, oh my goodness, I mean, what are we at now? 16 million members, 18 million members, I forget. That would take a long time. So anyway, we don't do that anymore, to say the least. And I would also mention here that that is the end of part 3 in Documents Volume 1. So now we're getting into part 4 and kind of a new era in the church. We're talking about the first sort of organized missionary effort going out west, which results in some major figures coming into the church and some enormous outpourings of people joining. I think a lot of current members of the church can actually trace their lineages back to this mission that happens. So yeah, beginning of part 4. So now we're into section 31. So again, earliest version, Revelation Book 1, handwriting of John Whitmer. It is called the 34th Commandment, and it is chapter 34 in the Book of Commandments. It is section 53 in the Doctrine and Covenants, first edition. And there is no difference in the section headings between 1981 and 2013. Again, we just took out the history of the church reference. So what's going on here? This Revelation Book 1 describes this revelation as, quote, a revelation to Thomas B. Marsh, his call to the ministry, etc., given at Fayette, Seneca County, state of New York, unquote. So don't think Gavin is a word anymore. I think we would say given, but they given it to him. Manuscript history says it's a revelation to Thomas B. Marsh. That's all you get. This is also the last thing that you get from what's called Draft 3 Fair Copy. This is what they were hoping to use to print what later became the volumes of the history of the church. So we are now done with yet another draft of the history of the church. And so 2 drafts are finished. We got 1 and 3 fair. It is all done. So the just to kind of give you a sense of kind of where we are with the documents that we have. So the historical introduction to section 31 from Documents Volume 1. According to his history, Joseph Smith dictated this revelation for Thomas B. Marsh during 26 September 1830 conference. Marsh, a resident of Charlestown, Massachusetts, who had earlier been affiliated with the Methodist Church, first learned of Joseph Smith and his activities when he visited Palmyra, New York in 1829. He later recounted that in the summer of that year, quote, I thought the Spirit required me to make a journey west. I started in company with one Benjamin Hall, who was also led by the Spirit. We went to Lima, Livingston County, New York, where we stayed some 3 months and then left for home, unquote. Before returning home, however, he stopped in Lyons, just 15 miles east of Palmyra, where he learned of the printing of the Book of Mormon. He then traveled to Palmyra, where he met Martin Harris, saw proof sheets of the first pages of the Book of Mormon, and spoke with Oliver Cowdery, who, according to Marsh, quote, gave me all the information concerning the book I wanted, unquote. Marsh returned to his home, interested in what he had learned, and carrying the first 16 printed pages of the book. On 25th of October, Marsh wrote to Cowdery to express his interest in the little band of believers and to inquire about their welfare. Cowdery reported to Joseph Smith that although Marsh had found some unwilling to listen, he had talked to some respecting our work. The correspondence continued, but the letters are no longer extant. Bummer. After learning by letter of the April organization of the Church of Christ, Marsh and his family moved to Palmyra in September 1830. Shortly before the second conference of the church in late September, David Whitmer baptized Marsh, and Oliver Cowdery ordained him an elder, most likely before Joseph Smith dictated this revelation. So once Thomas joins the church, it goes fast. He's like an elder, and right away he's more or less called on a mission. Now, I'm going to point something out here, and completely my opinion, but if you go to the E.B. Grandin bookstore, which is now owned by the church as a historical site, you'll go in there and there's going to be missionaries there, and they're going to teach you about how, the printing presses worked and all this kind of stuff. And sometimes, if you're a good little boy or girl, they will give you a gathering of the Book of Mormon so you could take it with you. Now, I am of the opinion after reading this stuff that I think that is in honor of Thomas B. Marsh. And the reason why is because Thomas B. Marsh later became one of the original apostles and outranked Brigham Young. He was the president of the Quorum of the 12 and the senior apostle. So theoretically, he had left the church by the time Joseph Smith was killed. But if he hadn't been, then Thomas B. Marsh would have been the one leading the saints to the Salt Lake Valley. And then, like a lot of people like to joke around about, it would be Thomas B. Marsh University instead of Brigham Young University. So don't know how true any of that is, but that's who Thomas B. Marsh is. And I'd like to think the little homage is being paid to a really good man, who eventually did leave the church, but he did a lot of good while he was there. So that's Thomas B. Marsh. So in the aftermath of this, and this is a very famous scripture. So if you serve a mission, and if you serve really in any capacity in the church, this is a very tender-hearted one, meaning it says in it, the hour of your mission has come, and I will take care of your family. Your family will live. Now, I know of a lot of missionaries, and I'm talking missionaries today, like 18, 19-year-old missionaries, who leave on missions under pretty harsh circumstances. And I'd like to believe that there's been a lot of comfort given from these scriptures that your family will be taken care of. And this was an edict also to the church. Like for missionaries going back in the day, their families were taken care of by fellow church members. And so a very special scripture. And so therefore, I loved the aftermath of this and some of the footnotes that we get. So footnote 3, for example, by her own account, Marsh's wife Elizabeth did not become a believer until 1831, when her son Nephi was born. Now, far be it from me, but you're a non-believer and you're going to name your son Nephi, which is a very Latter-day Saint name. I'm not worried about you probably converting. Anyway, I just thought that was kind of funny. You're going to name your kid after a Book of Mormon person. Anyway, the revelation also addressed Marsh's understandable concerns about his family's welfare as he traveled and preached, promising him that his family would be blessed during his absence. Although the revelation does not indicate where he was to preach, he remained in New York until the spring of 1831 and corresponded with relatives in Massachusetts, urging them to join the believers. In June 1831, he was called to travel to Missouri and preach along the way. Now, there's also a reference here that Marsh is to be a physician. So what's that all about? Well, the best thing that we have here is 2 accounts in Marsh's brief autobiography indicate that during the early years of his church membership, he was called upon to act in a medical capacity. While en route from Ohio to Missouri, he was summoned to care for a brother Blacksley, suffering from cholera, but was unable to reach him in time to treat him. Another time, he cared for Joseph Knight, who was sick with the bloody flux, or dysentery, for those of you that play the Oregon Trail. Marsh later became one of the original 12 apostles and served as the president of the Quorum of the 12. So that's section 31. Kind of fun. So our next part is going to be part 2. We're going to be talking about revelations given in October of 1830. So stick around for that. Okay, we're back for part 2. This is the revelations given in October of 1830. So this is sections 32 and 33 of the Doctrine and Covenants as we have it now. As an introduction to section 32, the earliest copy that we have is from Revelation Book 2, and the handwriting is in Frederick G. Williams' hand. So I'm going to say that one more time. This revelation does not exist in Revelation Book 1. Just poof, gone. I was looking for it and I was like, did I miss it? No, it is only in Revelation Book 2, and it's not because it was lost. It's just not done. So the Revelation Book 2, as you can see here, is written very differently. There's not the fancy commandment at the top. It's not as well organized, but the handwriting is Frederick G. Williams's. So that's where we get it from. So we're going, hold on to your seats. We're in a different Revelation book right now. Hopefully that doesn't shock you to the core too much. But one explanation that we have about why that happened says, from the Joseph Smith papers, it is possible that Pratt took the only copy with him when he left on his mission, making it unavailable for inclusion when John Whitmer was compiling the relevant portion of the book. So thank you for the revelation. I'm going to pocket that, and on I go to my mission, Brother Pratt. So if you ever get a revelation from a prophet, maybe see if somebody wants to write it down before you take it with you. But fortunately, we still have it, and so it wound up in Revelation Book 2. But just a little pro tip there for any of you out there, maybe getting prophetic revelations and going on missions. Not for me to say, but history teaches us lessons. So because of that, this section is actually not included in the Book of Commandments. So I got nothing to show you there. It is section 54 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, and there is no difference in the section headings of our modern scriptures except for the removal of the history of the church. So kind of fun. We, they kind of missed the boat on Revelation book 1 and the Book of Commandments. So that's why. So again, leave some stuff behind, for heaven's sakes. And the introductions we get to this from Revelation book 2 states Revelation to Parley P. Pratt to go to the wilderness. Doctrine and Covenants from 1835 says Revelation to Parley P. Pratt and Ziba Peterson, given October of 1830. So, what do we get out of the manuscript history? And we're going to have to sort of run low on this because it's coming to an end. The manuscript history describes that there was a 3-day conference where a lot of harmony prevailed. We've already spoken to this already. Draft 2 says this. At this time, a great desire was manifest by several of the elders respecting the remnants of the house of Joseph, the Lamanites, residing in the west, knowing that the purposes of God were great to that people, and hoping that the time had come when the promises of the Almighty in regard to that people were about to be accomplished, and that they would receive the gospel and enjoy its blessings. The desire being so great that it was agreed upon we should inquire of the Lord respecting the propriety of sending some of the elders among them, which we accordingly did, and received the following revelation. So that is from Draft 2. Now, I want to make a shout out here because I love Bruce a lot. Parley P. Pratt wrote an autobiography that a lot of people have used as a major reference for church history. Autobiography of Parley P. Pratt. It's very cleverly named. Anyway, he has a very famous conversion story that is so famous that actually the church filmed an edition of it. So if you got your YouTubes open, it is called How Rare a Possession. And it's the story is actually told in Histories Volume 1. But if you get a chance, Bruce Newbold is the main character in it, and he's a great actor, and for heaven's sakes has like the best voice in the business. So watch his version. It's actually quite nice. It's not really his version, it's the church, but he does such a great job in that film. But a little from the historical introduction, a very, very famous conversion story and what led to him receiving this revelation. So this is from the historical introduction of Documents Volume 1. With his long-standing interest in the American Indians, Pratt no doubt welcomed the call. He had set out for Ohio from New York in the fall of 1826 when he was 19 with plans to preach to the Indians. However, Pratt did not then follow through with his plan. Instead, he built a small log hut some 30 miles west of Cleveland, Ohio, and spent the winter in reading and study, especially of the Bible. The following summer, he returned to New York, married Thankful Housley, Hasley, and went back to Ohio with his new bride. So apparently he's always had a major interest in like reaching out to Native Americans and sharing the gospel with them. Didn't quite do it. This revelation specifically had him preach to them. So it's kind of fun. So here's a bit of the story about Parley P. Pratt. Story of faith is what we got here. So in 1829, Pratt, who was a Baptist, was influenced by Sidney Rigdon, a restorationist preacher affiliated with Alexander Campbell. Attracted by the Campbellites' efforts to recreate the primitive church of the New Testament and by their expectation of Christ's second coming, Pratt decided to become an itinerant preacher of their message. In the summer of 1830, Pratt and his wife left Ohio for their, quote, native place, Columbia County, New York, where he planned to preach. En route by canal boat, Pratt responded to what he felt were spiritual promptings and disembarked at Newark near Palmyra, leaving his wife to travel on alone. Pratt encountered a Baptist deacon who loaned him a copy of the Book of Mormon. He soon, quote, knew and comprehended that the book was true, unquote. Pratt then traveled to Palmyra area where he met Hiram Smith. Shortly after, the two traveled to Fayette, where Pratt was baptized into the Church of Christ and ordained an elder. He then continued on to Columbia County to rejoin his wife and proselytize friends and family. So he definitely made the trip worth it. So by the time, like from the start of his trip to the time he saw his wife again after his trip was over, he read the entire Book of Mormon, which you'll see there. He read it in a day, basically, believed it right away, and met Hiram, went to Fayette, met the prophet, joins the church, gets a revelation, heads back home. I mean, it's a heck of a road trip, to say the least. Um, as far as the mission and the return trip, quote, Pratt soon learned of the call Cowdery and Whitmer had received to preach to the Lamanites. Not long after the revelation featured here, called Pratt, along with Ziba Peterson, to accompany them. Peterson, a resident of Macedon, New York, was a founding elder of the Church of Christ and received an elder's license on the 9th of June, 1830. And by the way, that is the end of drafts 2 and 3. So the entire early drafts of the manuscript history of the church are now over. That's all you get. And by the way, I will add to that, and I'll just hold it up here. Histories Volume 1, we won't be using this one for quite a while. It'll be in the histories a few more years before these books come out again. So that's that for that. Which means, and get ready for this, we're going to be starting to use Histories Volume 2, which is going to be kind of fun. We'll get into that in a moment. So we're going to set that book aside. So the aftermath of this revelation, fortunately for us, we actually have. It is what is currently called the Covenant of Oliver Cowdery and Others, October of 1830. So again, this is kind of fun, but the earliest version of this document that we have is actually in the Ohio Star that was published on the Thursday, October 8th, 1831. This version is in a bound volume and is found in the Library of Congress. Again, wow, like the people who researched this went far and wide to find this stuff, but this is the first version that we have. The entire left column, as you can see here, is entitled Mormonism. And it talks about, quote, the Aborigines of this country being from the house of Israel and so forth, and basically gives a bunch of Book of Mormon stories and explanation. After that, we get Doctrine and Covenants, section 28 is published here, which is Oliver Cowdery's call and the whole thing about Hiram Page and seer stones. Then we get a covenant between Oliver and 3 other men with 2 witnesses. So the people on the page are Joseph Smith Jr., David Whitmer, Parley P. Pratt, Ziba Peterson, and Peter Whitmer. And that's what it is. And we'll get to this, hopefully. Well, we'll get to this in a moment. The historical introduction of this. In the following signed statement, Cowdery committed himself to follow the commandment he had received, and Whitmer, Pratt, and Peterson promised to assist Cowdery. This is the earliest extant document following the establishment of the Church of Christ, in which individuals covenanted in writing to obey commandments of God. And maybe there's others, but I thought it was interesting. There was a covenant between, I would call it probably the leader of the mission and the others going with him. Like, you're going to do this, and they say, yes, we are. Signed to it, and they published it in the paper. And as you will see, probably not on purpose. Anyway, I will say the only other thing that would equate to this would be Martin Harrison and Joseph Smith did have an agreement that Martin Harris would take care of the 116 pages, and that agreement was broken, and we lost the pages. So, another thing we get from the historical introduction is the signed covenant indicates that Cowdery, Whitmer, Pratt, and Peterson were not only to preach the gospel among the Lamanites, but also, quote, rear up a pillar as a witness where the temple of God shall be built, unquote, in the New Jerusalem. So this is fulfilling prophecies in the Book of Mormon. And yeah, this whole idea that there's going to be a temple built and a city built and all this kind of stuff was a major part of it. And as they preached this, it also is sort of a precursor to the idea that believers are eventually going to have to move. And this was a major feature of Latter-day Saint religion for a while, decades and decades and decades, even after they moved to Salt Lake City, where if you join the church, you're going to gather physically to the saints. You're going to come to the same place. You're going to leave wherever you are and join us. So we'll get to that a little bit more as the stories move on. So yeah, footnote 7 here says the Palmyra, New York Reflector reported that Cowdery and his companions, quote, had been directed to locate the site of the New Jerusalem, which they should know the moment they should step their feet on it, unquote. So the text featured here, this again is from the history that we get. The text featured here was included in a letter from Ezra Booth to Ira Eddy. Eddy and Booth were two of the earliest Methodist preachers in Geauga, Guga, and Portage counties. I don't know how to say that word. Anyway, Booth embraced Joseph Smith's message in May of 1831, but he became disillusioned and left the church a few months later. Soon after, he began writing his grievances, accompanied by this and other documents in a series of letters to Eddy that were later printed in the Ravenna newspaper, the Ohio Star. The text of the covenant appeared in the 8 December 1831 edition of the Star, accompanying the 8th letter, and was later published in the 20 December 1831 issue of the Painesville Telegraph. There they are again. Even though Booth published this document in an effort to discredit the church, the fact that he accurately quoted other Mormon documents gives his text credibility as a legitimate copy of a non-extant document. So, again, I don't want to say anything about the guy. I don't really know much about his history to this point, but I mean, at least he was accurate. So what we have here is an effort to sort of disillusion people from the church, but he was very accurate about it. So, thank you for that. We'll use it. So, contents of this covenant. We get a footnote here. The first two signatories, Joseph Smith and David Whitmer, were apparently witnesses to the two covenants. Although the newspaper listed their signatures together with those of the other three who signed the covenant as additional missionaries to the Lamanites, the separation between the two groups was probably clear in the original document. So that's what it is. So, yeah, so basically what you get is, and you kind of have to hand it to them at the Ohio Star, sort of a precursor to the Latter-day Saint religion and why they're thinking about going to, as we call it, the Lamanites back then. And then you get the revelation telling Oliver Cowdery to go on a mission. And then you get a covenant that he is going to go on a mission and be a good boy about it. So all of that is printed in the Ohio Star. So thank you, Ohio Star. You're great. And we still have it to this day, which is great, in the Library of Congress. So let's move on to section 33. So the earliest version of this we have is in Revelation Book 1, which is the handwriting of John Whitmer. It is listed as 35th and 36th commandment, so it may have been two revelations, and this is the only time we see that sort of thing happen in Revelation Book 1. So these are not separate, as you can see here. In line, it says 35th and 36th, and then gives it as one text. Lots of editorial marks going on here, holy cow. There's actually verse numbering, which is honored in the Book of Commandments. And a few of those verses are actually honored to this day. So if you look in your current scriptures and compare that with this document, you'll find that a lot of the verses land on the same words. They're sort of, the verse breaks happen in the same place. Mostly these sort of corrections are done in the handwriting of Sidney Rigdon, and some of them are William W. Phelps. So that's what you see written on the actual document itself. It is chapter 35 in the Book of Commandments. It is section 55 in the original Doctrine and Covenants. So, a circumstantial introduction to this. Also no difference between the two revelations. Revelation Book 1 says, a commandment to Ezra Thayer and Northrop Sweet, their call to the ministry, etc., given at Fayette, Seneca County, state of New York. The manuscript history has no more drafts. We're all done. So what we call draft 1, 2, 3 and the fair copy are now finished. So we leave History's Volume 1 for now. This is found, if you look in the actual Volume 1 of the History of the Church, this is found in chapter 12, is kind of where we are just in the narration. And this, again, is what was used for a long time to dictate sort of how the Doctrine and Covenants was published and printed. And it says from that chapter, quote, the Lord, who is ever ready to instruct such as diligently seek in faith, gave the following revelation at Fayette, New York. The section headings are a little different here. Section heading was changed ever so slightly. It used to say it says the prophet affirmed that the Lord is ever ready, so forth and so on. In 2013, it says Joseph Smith's history affirms, so forth and so on. I think just kind of clarifying who may have written the words themselves. So there you go. Because they don't really know if that was the prophet who said it, if that was Joseph Smith who said it. So from the historical introduction from Documents Volume 1, very interesting story here. So Joseph Smith dictated this revelation for Ezra Thayer and Northrop Sweet in early October 1830, within a month of their baptisms in the Church of Christ. The revelation appointed them to the ministry and provided instruction regarding their preaching. Later in his life, Thayer wrote that he was prepared for the revelation by a vision in which, quote, "A man came and brought me a roll of paper and presented it to me, and also a trumpet, and told me to blow it. I told him that I never blowed any in my life. He said, 'You can blow it, try it.' I put in my mouth and blowed on it, and it made the most beautiful sound that I ever heard. The roll of paper was the revelation on me and Northrop Sweet. Oliver Cowdery was the man that brought the roll and trumpet. When he brought the revelation on me and Northrop Sweet, he said, 'Here is a revelation from God for you,'" unquote. So a little bit of a dream. And trumpets, blowing the trumpet is usually like, kind of a call, a preaching of the gospel. This is one of the reasons why the Andrew Moroni has a trumpet, and that's the symbol that's there. So it's kind of a beautiful story. Uh, George Albert Smith, or George A. Smith, I should probably say. George Albert was a different person, sorry. George A. Smith recalled, Thayer also recalled that following this revelation, Sweet soon left the church. George A. Smith, Joseph Smith's cousin and later a church apostle, explained that Sweet and 5 others left the church and organized the Pure Church of Christ, as they called it, composed of 6 members, and commenced having meetings and preaching. But that was the extent of the growth of this early schism. Thayer, on the other hand, gathered a large congregation to hear Joseph Smith preach. According to his own account, Thayer filled his barn and some could not get in, where Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, John Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Jr., Parley P. Pratt, and Ziba Peterson preached with great power. So one kept with it and one did not. And thus it is. So that is all that we have for part 2, our next part that we have here. All right, we're chugging right along with part 3. These are revelations, or revelation, I should say, given in November of 1830. This is section 34, and we're also going to go through 2 letters that we have. So jumping right in, the earliest version of this is also in Revelation Book 1, handwriting of John Whitmer, like the others, and it is called the 37th Commandment. It is chapter 36 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 56 in the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. There are no differences between section headings of 1981 and 2013, except for the removal of the history of the church. So kind of blew through that pretty quick. We do get mentions from the modern section headings that the revelation was given in the home of Peter Whitmer Sr. So that's the addition that we get that isn't really in these earlier versions that we have. So what gives on this one? So Revelation Book 1 gives us this as a background. It says a commandment to Orson Pratt, his call to the ministry, etc., given at Fayette, Seneca County, state of New York. Manuscript history, again, we don't get anything from drafts because we're all done with those, but what we get out of Volume 1, page 127 of the Manuscript History of the Church, which is now, I guess, the history of the church. In the forepart of November, Orson Pratt, a young man 19 years of age who had been baptized at the first preaching of his brother Parley P. Pratt, September 29th, his birthday, about 6 weeks previous in Cana, New York, came to inquire of the Lord what his duty was and received the following answer. Now, that number is very significant to the church because for the majority of the 20th century, I would say, you were called to serve a mission when you were 19 years old. That is when I was called to serve my mission. That was changed very recently to 18 years old. So basically, as soon as you're done with whatever the high school requirement is, Amazar were for your country, once you're kind of considered that full-blown adult, you can serve a mission as a man. So that's the thing. It used to be 21 years old for women. Now it's 19 years old for women. But kind of the idea is like you're done with school and you're sort of free to go out and serve a mission. So this age of 19 and the fact that it was on his birthday is special, isn't it? So there you go. Um, so the historical introduction to this we get from Documents Volume 1. Again, Orson was baptized on his birthday, travels about 200 miles to where his brother is staying, and arrives after Parley gets the revelation to serve a mission. So this is the previous revelation that we have. And then we get this from the historical introduction. Orson Pratt later explained that he too wanted to know his duty and requested that Joseph Smith inquire of the Lord for him. The result, according to Pratt's account, was the following 4th November 1830 revelation, dictated by Joseph Smith in his presence and written down by John Whitmer. So there is somebody named James Van Cleve who shared an experience. He says, historical introduction says, according to Van Cleve, Pratt recounted that after he was ordained an elder in the Church of Christ, he was anxious to know what his mission was and would be. And at Peter Whitmer Sr.'s residence, he asked Joseph whether he could not ascertain what his mission was. And Joseph answered him that he would see, and asked Pratt and John Whitmer to go upstairs with him. And on arriving there, Joseph produced a small stone called a seer stone, and putting it into a hat, soon commenced speaking, and asked Brother Pratt to write as he would speak. But being too young and timid, and feeling his unworthiness, he asked whether Brother John Whitmer could not write it. And the prophet said that he could. Then came the revelation. I would probably do the same thing. Like, dude, I'm new here. I don't know if I want to do that. So John Whitmer wrote it down. Kind of special. So he gets called on his mission. And Orson Pratt later becomes an apostle of the church as well. In fact, he has a very major presence in, as I'm pointing out here, the Journal of Discourses. He actually speaks really long. I love Orson Pratt, but boy, his speeches in the Journal of Discourses they go on for pages and pages. So he could speak, and he was a very good speaker. So what's the aftermath of this? Well, the historical introduction says, though the revelation itself does not specify the area where Pratt was to preach, he later explained that his mission was to Colesville, Broome County, New York. The revelation left a deep impression on Pratt. Quote, I thought that was a very great and important calling. I felt, therefore, the importance of those sayings, and truly, when I looked at the magnitude and importance of the command given to me to prophesy by the power of the Holy Ghost, I felt oftentimes to tremble and shrink for fear I never should be able to fulfill and accomplish so great a work. Unquote. Despite such trepidations, Pratt had, by 2nd December 1830, been ordained an elder and was on his way to Colesville to begin his mission. Footnote 7 here also says Pratt carried with him a letter from Joseph Smith and John Whitmer that declared to the members in Colesville that Pratt had been, quote, chosen, ordained, sanctified, and sent, quote, as another servant and apostle. So even though he wasn't like officially an apostle at the time, one sent forth, sort of the dictionary definition came true there. So that's section 34, another call to a mission. Next thing we get here is a letter from Oliver Cowdery, given 12th of November, 1830. Document introduction to this. This is only found in Newell Knight's history. And from a previous episode, 2 episodes ago, I believe, this one was found, like this Newell Knight history was found in a tin box in a basement in Provo, New York. So you never know what you find. But yeah, this is the only surviving copy of this. And it's an unidentified handwriting because other people helped Newell Knight make his history, and there's a lot of people it could have been. We just don't know exactly whose handwriting it is. So that's how we have this. So I think that's fascinating. It's in the Church History Library now. It was actually found many, 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 many years ago, and has been in church custody since then. So this is a story kind of about how Sidney Rigdon joins the church, and he is an incredibly large figure in church history. So it goes like this. En route to the Indian Territory in present-day eastern Kansas, one of the 4 missionaries, Parley P. Pratt, called on Sidney Rigdon, who was his former friend and instructor in the Reformed Baptist Society. The letter below suggests that the group had planned before their arrival to stop briefly in the Kirtland area and seek out Rigdon. The missionaries found Rigdon and many of his parishioners ready recipients of their message, and the letter describes their success. So these people were really looking forward to this. So just to give a history about the Campbellites, and this is where Rigdon and his people, and quite frankly, why did the church move to Kirtland, Ohio? This explains a lot of it. So for nearly a decade prior to meeting the missionaries, Rigdon was affiliated with Alexander Campbell in a mutual quest to reclaim, quote, the ancient order of things. Campbell and his colleagues were known for their teaching based on Acts 2:38 that baptism, rather than being an experience of grace, was the divinely appointed means of receiving a remission of sins. Yet, as an early follower clarified, their call to reform Christianity did not begin nor end in baptism. It saw as its end and sought nothing less than the deorganization of sect and the reorganization of the saints in the express terms and conditions divinely set forth in the Holy Scriptures. Many reformist congregations in northeastern Ohio eventually severed denominational ties and by the early 1830s reorganized under Campbell's leadership as, quote, disciples of Christ. So the organization did eventually fall apart as we get from here. Quote, ministers of the Mahoning Association, a reform-minded branch of the Baptists of which Campbell and Rigdon had been key members, voted to dissolve. So poof, they're gone. So these people are kind of left without a home, more or less. And this kind of led to their acceptance of the missionaries. So again, from the historical introduction, about 2 months later, Pratt and his associates arrived at Rigdon's home proclaiming a restoration of ancient truth and divine authority. His prior commitment to Christian primitivism enabled Rigdon, as well as his followers, to listen closely to the missionaries. Later, an editorial in a Mormon newspaper looked back with gratitude on the Ohio converts' connection to Campbell, affirming that their minds, quote, were prepared for the work through the belief and reception of many of the principles propagated by Alexander Campbell. And we will even go further and acknowledge that the Lord permitted the propagation of those principles as a forerunner to the fullness of the gospel, though its advocates knew it not, unquote. So, kind of fun. So, what are the contents of this letter? Well, it's written from Kirtland, Geauga County. Can somebody help me out with that? How do you say this county? Geauga. Geauga. I don't know. Anyway, Geauga sounds like a horn. Anyway, sorry, not being disrespectful. I just don't know how to say it. They did leave two books of Mormon, with something called the Buffalo Tribe. So on their way to Ohio, they meet a tribe of Native Americans in the Buffalo area who later returned to where they were going, but they preached to them what the story was, gave them some copies of the Book of Mormon, and moved on with their life. So kind of cool. So they did preach to the Lamanites, if you will, as they were instructed to. They then had a meeting with the Campbellites who were trying to, quote, separate from the world as much as possible. And what they basically, the Morley family decided to have a communal relationship and really separate themselves off physically and spiritually from the rest of the world, which was a semi-common practice back then. So Sidney Rigdon is one of the first 55 baptized into this new faith. So big thing. If you recall from a previous part, there were 62 members at their last conference. So having 55 people join the church is a big deal. In the letter, Oliver is also kind of requesting, we need about 500 copies of the Book of Mormon to be sent to the Kirtland area. We got a lot of work to do here. So it's kind of exciting. So some footnotes to this letter. Footnote 5, which I find to actually be quite a touching story, and I think reflects a lot of what many other families probably went through, in my opinion. Totally my opinion. But there's a message from Sidney Rigdon to his wife, whose name was Phoebe Brooks Rigdon. So just kind of sharing this from the footnote. He informed her what the consequence would undoubtedly be respecting their worldly circumstances if they obeyed the gospel, and then said, quote, my dear, you have once followed me into poverty. Are you again willing to do the same? Unquote. She answered, quote, I have weighed the matter. I have contemplated on the circumstances in which we may be placed. I have counted the cost, and I am perfectly satisfied to follow you. Yea, it is my desire to do the will of God, come life or come death. Unquote. Accordingly, they, Mr. Rigdon and his wife, were both baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know. Um, I guess in the spirit of full disclosure, I will say I've been married to a woman very similar to this, who, married me under not good circumstances. We lived in a small apartment, then we moved to something else. We moved to Utah during COVID, so I'm in Utah now. And we had moved 6 times and lost a lot of money doing it and just had to go through that kind of stuff. Now, I am not comparing myself to what these people went through, but to have a husband and wife agree that sometimes you're gonna make a decision and there might be some bad consequences to follow it, but you're gonna do it together is a very touching story to a married man. So, root for Mr. Rigdon and his wife. Phoebe Brooks Rigdon seems like a very incredible woman and very eloquent in how she spoke. And again, like I said, these two had an enormous, massive, big, huge influence on the church. In a previous episode, we talked about the Joseph Smith translation. Yeah, you have it. Sidney Rigdon was a major part of it. So anyway, a very touching story. I just loved it. Gushing aside. Footnote 6, Parley recalled later, the interest and excitement now became general in Kirtland in all the region round about. The people thronged us night and day, insomuch that we had no time for rest or retirement. By the time the missionaries departed Kirtland, they had baptized 127 souls. So big deal there. So that is the letter from Oliver Cowdery reporting back to the prophet and others. So the next thing we have is a letter to the church in Colesville. So Joseph Smith is now writing letters. So whenever in the Joseph Smith papers you see like to or from, it's usually addressed to or from, the prophet. So the 2nd of December, 1830 is when this is done. The paper's introduction again is from Newell Knight's History, the thing left in a basement in Provo. Unknown handwriting because we don't know who did it in the history itself. This is a letter from Joseph Smith and John Whitmer as the likely scribes. So Joseph Smith usually would dictate these letters, and John and others would scribe them down. So, historical introduction to this letter. This letter gives instructions to the church members in Colesville, New York, in general, but also addresses Joseph Smith's brother Hiram Smith in particular. At the time Joseph Smith and John Whitmer wrote it, Hiram and his wife, Joshua Barden Smith, were living in Colesville with Newell Knight and his wife, Sarah Colburn Knight. Hiram Smith and Newell Knight were engaged in preaching in the area. The letter included a copy of the most recently received letter from Oliver Cowdery, who reported on the great success he had and his 3 missionary companions were experiencing in the area around Kirtland, Ohio. So as you read this, there's going to be a portion that's just a straight up copy of the letter we just spoke about from Oliver Cowdery, which is kind of fun. Most of these letters are now lost. So this letter, according to the historical introduction, was apparently part of an ongoing correspondence, not all of which is extant, between Joseph Smith and members of the church in Colesville. Like Joseph Smith's August 1830 letter to members in Colesville, it reflects a belief in an imminent second coming and cites international political conflict and natural catastrophes as evidence that, quote, the prophecies of the Book of Mormon are fulfilling as fast as time can bring it about, unquote. By the end of December, they were told to move in a revelation. So, to kind of put this into perspective, the church was organized April 8th, 1830, and by the end of that year, they were gone. And I may say that from the time that this was given, and we're going to get to that in December of 1830, there's hints that, hey, just so you know, Colesville and some other places, we're going to be moving to Ohio, right? And as you may have seen from a couple of episodes ago, Joseph Smith and Emma just paid off their home to Emma's parents and then never lived in it. They moved away almost immediately. So some tough decisions these people had to go through. So moving on with the historical introduction here, the inclusion of Cowdery's letter with its encouraging commentary on the work in Kirtland may have helped prepare members in Colesville to respond positively to the call to leave New York and remove to that distant location. However, no other evidence indicates that Joseph Smith was contemplating a move to Ohio prior to the 30th of December revelation, which specifically states you are to move to the Ohio. Some footnotes to this. Not really nice talking about Colesville, but the phrase Satan's seat is used in the book of Revelation Joseph Smith may have used the phrase to describe Colesville because throughout the summer of 1830, members and believers were persecuted there. So, not the nicest thing to say about the town you're living in. Footnote 12 here says, at the time this letter was composed, Joseph Smith was in the midst of dictating an expanded account of the biblical Enoch. Shortly after writing this letter, Joseph Smith dictated a lengthy prophecy of Enoch, a portion of which dealt with the last days and the second coming of Christ. These are all mentioned in this letter that is to the Colesville saints. Kind of as a thing, like, this is probably why this is happening to us, just because it's the end of days, things like that, from what he gets from the biblical Enoch. That, by the way, the prophecies of Enoch, all those things, that would be considered later chapters in the book of Moses, which is in our Pearl of Great Price. Now, there's a word here that shows up called phials, P-H-I-A-L-S, and it is a contemporary spelling of the word vials. I thought that was interesting. However, something I would encourage when you're singing songs or when you're reading old books, it's also kind of an indication of their dialect. So if you look at the Constitution of the United States, for example, there is what looks like a fancy F, but with no crossbar on the F. That is a sh sound in the International Phonetic Alphabet. And so there's some indication that they may have that term, that phoneme, all over the place in the Constitution in the 1700s. So sometimes when you see files, that might have been like, maybe they said files instead of vials, When you're singing songs, sometimes when the rhymes don't quite fit, it's because maybe you're supposed to be rhyming the second word as if it was the first, and it'll kind of give you an indication of their dialect and how they spoke. So just kind of a side note there, I find interesting, a little pastime of mine when I'm reading old stuff. And then there's this thing that is spoken. It's a phrase, beware of the Freemasons. Now, it doesn't really refer to the religion of Freemasonry. So if you're not aware, Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith were Freemasons. And a lot of our founding fathers in the United States were Freemasons. So it's not talking about the religion, but apparently footnote 25 clarifies that statement a little bit from this letter. It says, Hiram Smith belonged to Palmyra's Mount Moriah Lodge number 112. When he left for Colesville, he owed a small debt to Alexander McIntyre, the Smith's family doctor. Lucy Mack Smith paid the debt in corn and beans, but was subsequently visited by several men seeking payment. Not believing her that the debt had already been paid, they were about to take stored corn when William Smith arrived and forced them to leave. So apparently some Freemasons got a little nasty about a debt owed, which I find fun that, man, I wish I could pay my debts in corn and beans. That'd be freaking awesome. I'd grow corn all day long. But yeah, that's what it meant by that. So it was specific to these people who were looking for a debt. So it wasn't about the religion itself or the organization, maybe, if you will. Probably religion is the wrong way of saying it. The rest of the letter is a copy of Oliver Cowdery's letter, which we've already read, and Hiram Smith was the intended recipient. So there you go for part 3, some things that happened in November of 1830. So in our next part, we're going to be getting into the December of 1830 editions, and that should close us up for this episode. So stay with us. It's a long one today. All right, part 4, and our final part for this week is December 1830 documents. We're going to be talking about section 35 and section 36. So getting right into it, section 35. The earliest version of this, again, is from Revelation Book 1, handwriting of John Wiltmer. And William W. Phelps adds verse numbers, which are, again, honored in scriptures, which is kind of fun to watch. Sidney Rigdon also adds some corrections to language. But the revelation itself is called the 38th Commandment. Takes up 3 pages. Bit of a lengthy one. It is chapter 37 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 11 in the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. So there are no section heading changes between 1981 and 2013, except for removing the history of the church reference. So some circumstantial introductions to this from Revelation Book 1. We get a commandment to Joseph and Sidney Rigdon, Sidney's call to writing for Joseph, etc. The history of the church that we have, again, we don't do drafts anymore, those are done. It says, in December, Sidney Rigdon came to inquire of the Lord, and with him came Edward Partridge. The latter was a pattern of piety, and one of the Lord's great men. Shortly after the arrival of these 2 brethren, Thus spake the Lord. Now, here's the fun part. We are now getting into a new book I'm holding up here, Histories, Volume 2. This is the thinnest of all the Joseph Smith Papers books. And inside of there, we get a book called The Book of John Whitmer. So John Whitmer was assigned to write a history for Joseph Smith entitled The Book of John Whitmer. Now, here's a look at it. And the cover, although it might be hard to see, and hopefully you can see it here, actually says church history. That's what's written on the cover with all the other things going on this cover. It was purchased by the church in 2024 from the Community of Christ. So this goes along with revision books and the Kirtland Temple and a bunch of other things that the church purchased from the Community of Christ. And as I've said before, as of now, it is April of 2025. So this is less than a year ago that the church actually acquired this. So at the time it was printed in this book, in this volume, it was done with permission from the Community of Christ. And once again, many praises and thanks to a marvelous organization for the great work that they did in preserving these records. So the handwriting of this is, wait for it, John Whitmer. He wrote his own book. So good for him. So what we get here for an introduction to this revelation from his book, I think is great. So he really tries to write in scriptorial language. So here's what it says. Now it came to pass, after Sidney Rigdon was and received into this church, that he was ordained an elder under the hands of Oliver Cowdery, he having much anxiety to see Joseph Smith Jr. the seer, which the Lord had raised up in these last days. Therefore he took his journey to the state of New York, where Joseph resided. He goes with Edward Partridge, and further to that we get, wherefore after Sidney Rigdon had been at Palmyra, a few days, he proclaimed the gospel. I think that means after a few days. He proclaimed the gospel in those regions round about, at which the people stood trembling and amazed, so powerful were his words. And some obeyed the gospel and came forth out of the water, rejoicing with joy, which is unspeakable, and full of glory. From thence he journeyed to Fayette, where Joseph lived, and there he also proclaimed the gospel, and in the regions round about, and there were members added. Now in those days Sidney Rigdon was desirous to have the seer inquire of the Lord to know what the will of the Lord was concerning him. Accordingly Joseph inquired of the Lord, and these are the words that were spoken to him, saying, and then you get the revelation. Documents Volume 1 actually offers some kind of interesting histories to the source note here. It says, a portion of another early copy of this revelation in the handwriting of David Whitmer survived through Sidman's Ryder family. Coming to the church historian's office in the late 1960s, Sidman's Ryder supplied the text to the editor of the Ohio Star, which published it in the 5th January 1832 issue. Ryder claimed that he received his version from David Whitmer. The text featured here, the Star version, was the existing portion of the Whitmer version from the Ryder family, are all similar with no significant variance. So it's not a complete copy, but here it is. And that's why it's not included as the original copy, but it would have predated Revelation Book 1, but it's just not complete. So that's why Revelation Book 1 is the OG that we actually look to. But we still have that little scrap of paper, and here we have it. Historical introduction here. Rigdon and Partridge from the Documents Volume 1, as Rigdon and Partridge arrived in early December 1830, and shortly thereafter Joseph Smith dictated a revelation for each of them. This revelation for Rigdon praised his previous ministerial labors and positioned him as Joseph Smith's scribe for Joseph Smith's inspired translation of the Bible. Rigdon remained in New York with Joseph Smith for the next 2 months until they both moved to Ohio. So a lot of what you get from what we now call the Joseph Smith translation, those footnotes, the appendix, what the reorganization called the New Translation or the Inspired Version, those were scribed mostly by Sidney Rigdon, which is fun. With little snippets in there from Emma Smith, John Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, but Sidney took the majority of it. And as you'll start to see, he also did a lot of the manuscript grammatical changes and things like that in the Revelation books. So he was a major part of the documents that we have today. So a footnote here, footnote 5, Telegraph editor Eber D. Howe wrote in 1834 that Rigdon had so thoroughly prepared the minds in a great measure of nearly 100 of those who had attended his ministration to be in readiness to embrace the first mysterious ism that should be presented. That surreptitiously he must have been the original author and proprietor of the whole Mormon conspiracy. And I will say that that theory actually holds to this day, that Sidney Rigdon somehow, like, kinda lied and was going back and forth to New York and kind of started the whole Mormon thing and kinda planted it back in Ohio and all that kinda stuff. That theory holds to this day. And I won't speak to it, but that's what this, the Painesville Telegraph editor, wrote. He was not a fan of Latter-day Saints, as is kind of obvious, I hope, but, anyway. Footnote 15 we get, the command here to Rigdon to watch over Joseph Smith acknowledges Joseph Smith's gifts, but also his fallibility. Similarly, an earlier revelation admonished Oliver Cowdery to, quote, stand by my servant Joseph faithfully in whatsoever difficult circumstances he may be. For the word's sake, admonish him in his faults, and also receive admonition of him, unquote. So what I find really interesting about these revelations is that it seems like very praising and very like, hey, you're doing great and, really loving it. But when it comes to Joseph Smith himself, you get this, like, he's got faults. He needs to be admonished. Admonish him when he messes up. I find that very interesting. And some people may see that as a proof of its truth, perhaps, that it's not just Joseph aggrandizing himself. But anyway, I find that whole thing very interesting. So again, I keep talking about this, but just to give a sense of Sidney Rigdon's importance to the whole Latter-day Saint church narrative. Footnote 18 says this, decades later, David Whitmer described Rigdon's impact on Joseph Smith. Quote, he soon worked himself deep into Brother Joseph's affections and had more influence over him than any other man living. He was Brother Joseph's private counselor and his most intimate friend and brother for some time after they met. Brother Joseph rejoiced, believing that the Lord had sent to him this great and mighty man, Sidney Rigdon, to help him in the work, unquote. They had a really wonderful relationship together. And I would also mention that I would say probably one of the most important revelations given in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 76, Sidney Rigdon actually saw it with Joseph, according to his records. So there you go. So that's section 35. Final section, long one today, lots of sections here, but section 36. This is immediately following section 35 in the history, and it was probably given basically at the same time. So again, you have a Sidney Rigdon, sort of called in the ministry, called to be a scribe, all those kind of things. Now we're talking to Edward Partridge, who would later become the bishop of the church. We'll get to that in a second. So it's in Revelation Book 1, handwriting of John Whitmer. Another copy, which is incomplete but predates this, is saved through the family of Simmons Ryder. As we said before, it's part of section 35, and it's in, it also has 35 in it, I should say, and it is in the Church History Library. So here it is. This is what it looks like, a scrap of paper with a revelation on it, which was saved over the years. It is chapter 38 in the Book of Commandments and section 57 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. There is no section heading difference between the current scriptures that we have, with the exception of removing the history of the church. Not a lot of circumstances behind this, because a lot of that was discussed previously. These two revelations were more or less given at the same time. But it was given to Edward Partridge, who became the bishop of the church. And so here's a photo of him. And actually, I found his gravestone. So there you go, which has his visage on it as well. So this is Edward Partridge, who is apparently a symbol of piety, or piety, however you want to say that. Revelation Book 1 states about this, a commandment to Edward Partridge, his call to the ministry, etc. The history of the church that we get is a revelation to Edward Partridge given December 1830. That's all you get. So not a whole lot here, because a lot of it's wrapped up in sections 35 introductions. What we do get here from Documents Volume 1 is that Partridge, a hatter living in Painesville, Ohio. My goodness, we can't get away from Painesville, Ohio, can we? And his wife Lydia were members of Sidney Rigdon's Reformed Baptist congregation. In early November 1830, they became interested in the Church of Christ when Oliver Cowdery, Parley P. Pratt, Ziba Peterson, and Peter Whitmer Jr., began preaching to and baptizing many individuals from Rigdon's congregation. Lydia soon converted, but her husband remained skeptical and insisted on visiting Joseph Smith in New York before becoming a member. Partridge and Rigdon traveled to the Palmyra area and then went on to Waterloo in Seneca County. They arrived at the home of Joseph Smith Sr. while Joseph Smith was giving a sermon. When Joseph Smith finished speaking, quote, "A request was made that any who felt to speak should," unquote. And Partridge stood and stated that he and Rigdon had visited the Smith family's Manchester farm and had spoken with their neighbors about the character of the Smith family. Based on those conversations, Partridge declared that the Smiths, quote, "had sacrificed for the truth's sake," unquote, and that he was ready to be baptized. After Partridge asked Joseph Smith to baptize him, Joseph Smith replied, quote, "You have traveled a long way this morning, and you are much fatigued, and I think you had better rest and take some refreshment, and tomorrow morning be baptized," unquote. Soon thereafter, Joseph Smith dictated this revelation for Partridge. 2 days later, on December 11th, Joseph Smith baptized Partridge, and on the 15th of December, Sidney Rigdon ordained him an elder. And that's Edward Partridge. He was the bishop of the church, of like the entire church, what we may call today the presiding bishop of the church, until his death. So, and he was apparently a very, very faithful, very strong, spiritually minded man. So there you go. Holy cow, that was 7 revelations and a whole lot of stuff in between. I hope this has added some color and some, again, the goal is to fill in the history for this era of time, but a lot of really incredible things with a very small group of people. So the church in this case, just in the time that we started this to the time it ended, you're talking about a near tripling of their numbers. So kind of fun. And I hope this has been helpful to you. Again, we're on YouTube. I say we, it's just me. I'm on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Let me know if there's anything that we need to add to this. I'm hoping that as we get into more specific revelations, we can start getting into like the a couple of the changes that were made in the text. But for now, I hope this has been helpful. Enjoy and have a great week. We'll see you next time on Filling in the History.